Like to introduce. There
Thanks
you
for
go.
the reminder, Bill.
You're welcome, Ange. So yes, we will be recording this webinar, and good timing. We're going to get started. I'll just quickly flip up the PowerPoint that we've got ready for this. So yeah, Durhan, before we introduce the panelists, do you want to just quickly give some background? This is a slide that you actually presented on 2 years ago. So over to you to explain why we're here and what we're doing.
Well, I really don't know what we're doing. I don't even know why we're here. I think I said to Bill, thank God, we're doing our court conference in November. We will not have to do PMPRB again. And guess what? Here we are. And I think it was a good decision to say, let's do this ahead of time, because we do not want this to suck up what it is we're trying to advance in terms of rare diseases. It's that old saying, right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. But I'm actually saying, fool me 3 times. Like, really? Did you not get it the first time when we were going through this? And I think it is very telling, as Bill says, that we can come back to exactly where we were 2 years ago and maybe 4 years ago, somebody said to me, in terms of where we are. I mean, I think we all know the challenges around therapeutics. And we certainly know that therapeutics for rare diseases can actually carry a very high price tag. But on the other hand, we also recognize that there's tremendous return that we have not actually been able to talk about as well as we should. But the other part for patients, of course, is where do we sit in the world, and how do we make sure that at the end of the day, patients in Canada are not disadvantaged relative to where patients are elsewhere. So yeah, where were we 2 years ago? For the PMPRB, Lives Matter, explore the impact of pricing policy on patients' lives and build policies, support drugs getting to Canadian patients. And maybe this is our fault, and we were having a little bit of a pre-talk right before we came on here, is that we have not been able, as the patient community, as the healthcare professional community, to really be able to put forth a strong statement that drugs save lives, that innovative therapies not only save lives, but they save more lives, they bring better quality of life, they save, the progression of diseases, and that at the end of the day, we go back to, a paper that was written out of Colombia, maybe some 20 years ago, the investment in innovative therapies return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 11 times what it costs. And we have not made that clear enough, that what we're not talking about is you're not putting money into a sinkhole, that when you invest in providing a therapy for a patient at the provision end, the return in terms of patient lives, in terms of the healthcare system, in terms of recurring costs, in terms of hospital and other medical cares, in terms of return to society, absolutely demonstrated to be there. So why is it that it's so hard for the PMPRB to get that? And why is it so hard for us to actually make sure that Canada stays at that front end of being able to get access? And we said that PMP should act less like a punitive body and more like a public good agency. Now, what is the role of the PMPRB? Nobody disagrees that we don't want to be paying excessive drug prices. We don't want to have to be paying more than might what be our fair share. On the other hand, we do not want to end up with prices that are so punitive that they're so focused on just what is the actual dollar that we drive out not only companies bringing in drugs, but as we have shown over and over again. I'm on this panel now with 3 of my favorite people, and Bill as well, who have been really speaking volumes of the importance of being able to make sure that we're able to put Canada in a position where we get drugs as soon as possible, but we also get investment in clinical drugs. We get investment in terms of research and development. And of course, increasingly, we even get investment in, in the manufacturing. And we kind of thought, okay, coming out of 2 years of COVID, seeing the huge responsible partnerships that took place between the public and the private, that we were now well on the way to being able to say we should apply this to all of the disease areas, and suddenly we're back to square zero. Really devastating. So I think we really want to make sure that we see Canada as one of those countries that can advance research and development. But in order to do that, we want to make sure that we're actually creating an environment that's actually quite favorable and supportive of pharmaceutical research and development, of drugs being able to do clinical trials, and of people coming in. So this is something that, has been really challenging for us, because it seems as if, on the one hand, we've got, certainly, as we all know, the huge advances in Canada's rare disease drug strategy. We're hoping on Monday and Tuesday that we can actually blow that wide open to really put in place the system that we think is going to be able to deliver on the optimal access and use of drugs, and really be totally cost effective, but beyond cost effective, a net return on that investment. So what do we need to do? We're appealing to everybody, and this is why this is so important. But we especially need to make sure that policymakers hear this, that coming up with this redux kind of a policy that is, in some respects, even worse than what we had on the past rounds, that this is absolutely not a way to start, and it runs counter to everything we've been able to talking about in terms of advancement, in terms of advanced research therapies, in terms of advancing rare diseases, certainly, and investing in, creating an environment which is going to be really favorable toward engagement. So I'll leave it at there. As I said, I did say to Bill, thank God we don't have to do this again. I'm hoping I say this now, and it's the last time we ever have to do this.
Well, let's see what happens. We're going to end the slide with some links for resources. Submissions are due to the PMPRB on December 5th, so please keep that in mind if anyone's on the line who are taking notes or want to engage. You have a couple more weeks to pull those together. Today's panel, we've got Neil Palmer. He's been on several CORD webinars in the past, currently a senior strategic advisor at PDCI Market Access, one of Canada's leading pricing and reimbursement consultancies. Neil I shouldn't say started his career, but he was in the early part of the PMPRB. I think, Neil, was that your second gig in government? You were certainly there right from the beginning when it was started, right?
Yeah, no, I started at Stats Canada, the health division, but from 1988 on, I was at PMPRB for several years.
Yeah, and we're lucky to have you here in North America, because you're called upon all over the world to talk about pricing at the global level, but also we're very fortunate to have you, sticking around Canada from time to time to explain and understand what's going on here. Michael Dietrich is joining us from Innovative Medicines Canada, where he is Director of Policy at IMC. And Mike, you've got some background in terms of pricing back at Brogan, if I'm not mistaken, helping companies navigate the system as it was then, and you've been carrying this file forward at Innovative Medicines Canada for the last several years. And Mike is here to tell us about the policy challenges that the guidelines present and give an update about how IMC is responding to these challenges, including through webinars like this. Lorene Redding is a global pricing expert at BeiGene, except for China. And BeiGene is a global biopharmaceutical company, and Lorene comes to us with decades of experience in market access and health economics. And I will say both Lorene and Durhan served on previous rounds of the guidelines consultations. So this is what we're into again, with a new set of guidelines that are a little bit terra incognita for what will happen, what could happen. And it'll be interesting to hear from both Lorene and Durhan about some differences that they've noticed in terms of what they experienced, a couple of years ago in terms of those proposed guidelines versus these ones, and what may need to happen in order to make sense of them. So I'm going to show just a couple of slides to explain and remind people about the Canadian pathway between Health Canada approval and patient access, and where the PMPRB sits. And just to give a note, and this is something that CORD has actually included in their past submissions to the PMPRB. There's a database that CORD keeps track of, and that's sort of started in mid-2019, and that's when the regulations were first finalized, of the 140 medicines that have been approved in the United States at the FDA, less than half have been even submitted to Health Canada. So only 68 medicines have actually been applied to Health Canada for approval. And a big part of why that number is so low is that the PMPRB reform has created so much uncertainty over the past 6 years. And there is ample data and analysis that have come forward to show that when you change, when you regulate drug prices down, that actually has an impact on the timing of when medicines are brought to that jurisdiction. Doesn't stop there though. Once it gets into Health Canada for approval for clinical effectiveness, or I should say clinical benefits, risk-benefit analysis, it then goes to the health technology assessment stage. And we spent a lot of time at CORD walking through what CADIF does and what ENES does for comparative clinical and economic reviews. They make recommendations to all of the governments across the country. And that's where they get together and they negotiate often confidential rebates, sometimes more innovative agreements to inform access in terms of what will go on the public drug programs, which is what happens down here in terms of provincial listings. And we know that they are long and variable from one province to another. All told, they take an average of 2+ years between Health Canada and getting all the way down to patients. Here's some of the data that we've seen recently, and this actually came out earlier this year, showing that Canada has had fewer and fewer globally launched medicines commercialized here in Canada. So an average of 35 medicines have been launched globally. That means at least 2 major jurisdictions. And over the last 5 years, only 20 per year have come to Canada. And that number has been declining, as you can see on this slide, year over year. And it's not as if all of the medicines that do actually get to Canada actually get to patients. If you look at this is the funnel that is presented in the Ward et al. Paper, and this is actually a paper that Durhan is a co-author on, where you had 63 drugs approved in the European Union. Only 2/3 of those were actually submitted to and got Health Canada approval, 44. Only 30 of those received a positive CADIF recommendation. So you lop off another quarter of those drugs that got Health Canada approval, and only 20 got through ENES in Quebec. And you ended up with only 24 medicines that made it through with completed PCPA negotiation, which is why this is shaped as a funnel. I think what we'll talk about next week at the CORD conference is how to turn this funnel into more of a cylinder, where you have more medicines get through faster to patients. So a quick reminder, and I'll call on Neil to jump in here as well. What is the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board? Because we haven't had this conversation in a while at CORD. It's a federal quasi-judicial regulatory agency with 2 functions. It regulates patented medicine prices, and it reports on research and development of the patented medicine sector, and utilization and cost of and spending of Canadians on those medicines. And its regulatory mandate is to ensure that patented medicine prices are not excessive, and it determines those maximum prices that can be charged for patented medicines in Canada. So the previous guidelines, it assessed, there's a typo there, prices based on a treatment's therapeutic value versus alternatives, and it considered the prices for the same medicine in 7 other countries. Neil, what am I missing here, or any other color to add? Sorry, Neil, I think you're on mute, or I can't hear you. Okay, so I'll just keep on going, assuming that Neil is going to jump back on shortly. The current situation where we are today and right now, we're in what we call an interim period. So previous cord webinars, we talked about the economic factors and the concern about how, sorry, Neil, you're back? Yeah. Here you are. Neil, am I missing anything from this slide in terms of what the PMPRB used to do previous to the final regulations getting changed earlier this year? No, you're on mute, Neil. You want to try again? Yeah. Sorry, Neil, you're still on mute. I can ask to unmute. There, this might actually work. I just asked you to unmute. There you go. You're good.
Yeah, it wouldn't let me unmute. Can you hear me all right now?
We're good. Yeah. Anything
All right.
to add on this one?
No, I mean, I think, and you've got a slide coming up on bright guidelines, and you know, the PMPRB's role has always been, you know, focused on excessive pricing and providing the industry with bright guidelines in terms of what those what price tests would be, so that manufacturers could set non-excessive prices in advance without having to go through a process. So that was, you know, right from the very, very beginning of the PMPRB, was to make sure there were clear, understandable price tests. And not that the industry necessarily agreed with them, but certainly they understood them. And that was, you know, a very important part of what PMPRB did.
Thanks, Neil. So yes, now we're in the interim period. Earlier this year, you know, the court said that the federal government can't move forward with the economic factors that were problematic because they were trying to incorporate health technology assessment calculations and market size into the regulations that would allow the PMPRB to regulate the rebated or confidential price further. The PMPRB now has the basket of 11 countries. So the United States and Switzerland have been pulled out. 6 lower price countries are in. You can see them there on the right. And the new regulations were implemented earlier this past summer. What this means right now, if a new medicine is launched, really no guidelines are in effect, and so there's no real rules around those patented medicines in terms of excessive pricing. Doesn't mean that PMPRB couldn't act if there was something that they really saw that was flagged. So what could go wrong? And this is really where we are in terms of what they've proposed. Where in the past, previous analysis would suggest a 20% price decrease due to the basket of countries. Today, and with the proposals that are on the table that we'll talk about, it's really impossible to know what the impact will be. And that's because there are no longer any price tests. All the PMPRB has proposed is that there is criteria that may start investigations. And as we'll hear from our experts on the line, the process is vague, complicated, and certainly hasn't been seen anywhere else in the world. Neil is going to talk about what this means in terms of reference pricing, how other countries reference Canadian a list or public prices. And interestingly, and you know, this proposal is not specifically linked or connected to any pharmacare programs or guarantee of funding. So even if the PMPRB is reviewing the list price, there's no guarantee that these medicines will get funded, and that funnel will fundamentally change to provide more patient access. And this is just something that you know, somebody sent me earlier this week, who, I don't know if they keep a microfiche or all of these stacked up, but this is a bulletin from very early in the PMPRB's existence from 1989, issue number 5, where the PMPRB was saying the alternatives to issuing guidelines with some more clarity on how they would actually interpret the Patent Act would be to resolve each suspected case of excessive price in the hearing room. And the board's opinion back then was that it would not be in the best interest of industry, the board, or the public, because it would be expensive, time-consuming, and confrontational, and it would not further the board's objective of voluntary compliance. And that's why the board noted the views from some patentees who expressed a desire for more specific guidelines, which are bright line tests to facilitate compliance. And I think that that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today, and we're going to hear a lot more from our experts in the run up to submissions. Neil, over to you to tell us about where we sit globally.
Great, thanks, Bill. And I need to unmute. Hang on. I'm unmuted.
Oh, you're good.
I'm good. So you can, keep reproducing this slide. So back to Durhan's comment, I can't believe we're still doing this. Well, I have to every year I'm updating this slide with more recent data and trying to summarize how the impact of PMPRB's latest iteration of guidelines. And in this case, the starting point for new medicines, and this is focused on new medicines, is to reduce prices. The starting point will be the median international price. Now they're calling these guidelines investigation criteria as opposed to price tests per se. And the problem with that is goes back to this whole certainty question, is if you don't know what the price test is going to be, then you have to rely on whatever these investigation criteria are. And these investigation criteria are certainly much lower in terms of the allowable prices compared to even more recent guidelines that have been draft guidelines that have come out from PMPRB. So the impact is going to be really significant. So the starting point is the median international price. Recall that in previous years, the goal of the PMPRB was that prices on average would be at the international median. The PMPRB's new starting point is the international median. So by definition, prices will have to, on average, be lower. And when you dig deeper into the PMPRB's guidelines, there's several price tests that always seem to go to the lower of. So combinations of the lower of the median or the lowest international price or the domestic therapeutic class comparison test. And that's what those acronyms stand for. So somewhere, and the question is how low. It's difficult to do a impact analysis because we're talking about investigation criteria. So we don't know after an investigation is triggered if prices will go even lower than what the criteria say, or if they'll permit somewhat higher prices. We just don't know. But what we do know is that prices will be significantly lower than they are today. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the big changes that happened over the course of the PMPRB consultations are several court cases, almost all of which have sided with industry's objections to the PMPRB's guidelines and to the regulations that were drafted. And one of the appeals of note, or one of the decisions of note, was in the Federal Court of Appeals decision in Alexion. Now, this was with respect to a particular product, but the decision itself is quite clearly directed at PMPRB's policies and mandate overall. And if we look at the first one, where it talks about the PMPRB's role is not to get reasonable prices or price regulation or consumer protection at large, or for lowering prices generally. It's directed at controlling patent abuse. And by patent abuse, that means charging prices so high that they abuse the underlying patent monopoly. And remember that patent monopolies are intended to provide the inventor of the new technology with some premium pricing during the term of the patent, which in Canada, the effective patent term is about 10 years. So a 20-year patent term, the first 10 years are typically used for clinical trials and getting product approved, and the final 10 years at what they call market exclusivity, where a manufacturer expects to recoup their investment. And so to abuse that would be to charge prices that are significantly higher or perhaps are egregious, much beyond the expected premium that the manufacturer should have. And so the judge in this case goes on to say, the judge of the panel writing the decision goes on to say that were the excessive price provisions directed at price regulation or lower prices or consumer protection, they would be constitutionally suspect. And then further, talks about this whole business of PMPRB writing itself a blank check. And this part is, I think, really relevant. In the particular case, the PMPRB did not justify why it was relying on the lowest international price. And the judge the judge writing the decision felt that the PMPRB was asking the court to sign a blank check. And the court in this case was very clear that this court does not sign blank checks. And when we have a set of guidelines that are based on investigation criteria with no price tests, just criteria for starting an investigation, essentially the PMPRB is asking to sign, or is preparing that have a set of blank checks where it's going to decide in each case just how it's going to regulate the price of a particular patented medicine. So again, this is completely contrary to what the courts in this example, what the courts have been saying. Can I have the next slide? So what are the takeaways? And I have several points here. First, PMPRB likes to talk about modernization. Well, this is a sort of a government euphemism to try and justify why it's making changes by saying it's modernized. It never really says why this updating is any better than what was there previously. It just calls it modernization to try and give a positive spin on it. But clearly, the policy intent here is to make Canada a low price country. And if we think back, and I think it was in one of the earlier slides, the idea is to have a 20% reduction or get prices down to the OECD median. And recall, that's not the PMPRB's job. The PMPRB's job is to ensure that prices of individual patented medicines are not excessive. It does not have a policy role in lowering drug costs generally. That's up to the provinces and the PCPA, and so there's already, those mechanisms are already in place. PMPRB's limited role is to ensure prices of individual patented medicines are not excessive. PMPRB continually seems to think that there will be no impact on access to patented medicines in Canada. But it seems to ignore that launch sequencing is an industry best practice. In other words, manufacturers look at where it can achieve the highest prices, because all countries, with the exception of the UK, US, and Sweden, reference prices in other countries. And it becomes pretty obvious that to justify or to protect prices in those countries that allow high prices or higher prices, that you have to launch in those countries first, and then go to low countries last. Now, there are other factors that can play a role in when products are launched in individual countries, but the starting point is always launch first in high price countries and last in lower price countries. And PMPRB seems to discount this. And this is really important for for products that are coming to Canada, particularly in rare disease products, where often these are companies with only one or two products, and they are very, very sensitive to protecting the prices of the products in countries where these products are launched. Innovation, for the very beginning of the PMPRB, there was a sense that products that offer the greatest value, the greatest level of therapeutic improvement, could be allowed higher prices than those that are very similar to products already on the market in terms of their level of therapeutic improvement. Again, this is very impactful for rare disease drugs, because PMPRB has decided that innovation doesn't matter anymore. The level of therapeutic improvement doesn't matter anymore. And when you look at other countries that have different price levels, countries like France and Germany and Italy and Japan, they all look at levels of therapeutic improvement. And these are built right into the algorithms for the prices that are permitted in those countries. The benefit of patent monopoly doesn't seem to apply to the pharma industry anymore when you take into account what PMPRB is trying to achieve. And so this would be the only industry where it is penalized for having a patent, because the patent is what puts the product under PMPRB's jurisdiction, and it takes away that whole benefit of a patent. And that's why some companies, some manufacturers, in fact, look at the option of abandoning their patents, because it doesn't provide any benefit if to the extent that PMPRB is going to limit its price. We have the landmark court decisions being ignored by PMPRB. This, in fact, started back in 2009 when PMPRB ignored a decision in terms of rebates to provinces, the reporting of rebates to provinces. They ignored that. and then tried to bring it back in through regulation, and again were shot down by the courts. And so time after time after time, the PMPRB has lost, and the Attorney General representing the PMPRB has lost in court, but they just seem to ignore it. And this time around, what they seem to be doing is saying, well, look, we'll recraft our guidelines so that they are not susceptible to judicial review, because we won't define any particular price test. We'll just describe them as investigation criteria. And that way they may not be susceptible to judicial review the way the old price tests were. So, rather than try and fix the guidelines, the approach seems to be to get around what the courts have said is likely unconstitutional. And that gets us to the policy intent that I've already described, that lowering prices by 20% or to the OECD median, that's not their role. That's the provincial role, that's a PCPA role, and PMPRB is going outside their constitutional mandate. The impact on price ceilings of the latest draft guidelines, and there's some preliminary impact analyses that have already started on this, and it appears that the number of products that would be required to take price reductions and the extent of those price reductions are even more severe than even the more recent draft guidelines that were severe on their own, that resulted in all these legal challenges. So these ones are worse. And now how PMPRB actually conducts the individual reviews is uncertain, and that is the next issue. When you have vague guidelines based solely on investigation criteria, this engenders uncertainty for industry. Nothing industry, not just the pharma industry, but any industry dislikes is uncertainty in terms of how their products will be treated by regulators when they enter the market. If you don't know what price you're going to be allowed, well, you'll probably just wait and launch somewhere else first. So overall, PMPRB is going to be perceived as a barrier to entry to the Canadian market, particularly for innovative new drugs, and particularly for innovative new drugs that benefit rare diseases. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Neil. And that's a good segue to Michael, who's going to tell us, why we should be, concerned about this from an industry perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging, as others have, this has been a long struggle. We have 5 years of policy challenges, litigation, and I think everyone kind of thought that this was behind us. The innovative industry, while we didn't always agree with the changes and the basket that would have real impacts, we were, essentially ready to move forward. And I think the federal government's intent was that it was time to move forward and put this policy behind us. But unfortunately, the October 2022 guidelines have really drawn all parties back into some pretty contentious discussions, and it seems clear from Neil's comments here that the PMPRB really does want to go further than just the international changes in this guideline approach. So I think it's worth reiterating the fundamentally different nature of this regime, moving from a system that is, really based around predictable rules to one that is based more on general investigation criteria. And this will really draw companies into some contentious discussions with the PMPRB. And I think importantly, where the PMPRB staff itself would have a really central role and an active role on a product by product basis. As Neil mentioned, there are, high concerns around particularly future access and investments. And while we're trying to put a better sense of the impact and put a number to it, I think it's actually telling that the PMPRB has said that they will not do an impact assessment. I think we should be pretty concerned about, rushing into fairly sweeping changes without seeing a bit more analysis, without seeing a bit more policy homework. I think regardless, we are hearing from our members that they have increasing concerns about the impacts and their abilities to invest in Canada. And I think it's worth calling out the, I think, laudable efforts of Minister Champagne on the innovation side to really rebuild our life sciences industry. And I think a big question in my mind as we go forward is he aware of these changes, and can we look to him to potentially intervene, given the significant challenges that the pharma sector will face. I think some of the rules will have clear implications and perhaps even target rare and oncology medicines. We see in the draft guidelines as really being inconsistent with success on the rare disease strategy, where I think the government does want to see a policy win. And I think we all want to see, to Durhane's earlier comment, we all want to see progress towards a comprehensive strategy. So on that point, maybe if you advance to the next slide, I'll kind of show you what I mean on that. So without getting too far into the weeds, one of the key challenges relevant to rare that I think and new oncology medicines is really buried in the fine print. And here on the slide, we have a scenario where your list price could be well in line or even below international norms, lower than the lowest even. But if there's an older product out there, even a generic product, you could get pulled as a company into these quasi-judicial proceedings with the PMPRB. And this is causing, I think, many rare disease companies to take note that it really comes down to a question of what is the ultimate price test that applies. And it's not at all clear from the guidelines, as Neil mentioned. So this all means a lot of uncertainty, casts a long shadow over the rare disease strategy. And so, you know, I think we've kind of heard maybe some suggestions, well, is this an edge case? Is this, you know, only 3% or 4% of cases? And, you know, is that concerning? And I think, you know, whatever that number is, you know, it does translate to real Canadians' lives. And I think, you know, we need to be careful regardless of whether or not the challenges are, you know, focused on a smaller number of products and in fact, products that may address small patient populations. Next slide, please. I just close by saying that there are also some very odd incentives created by the proposed rules. A product would be automatically under an investigation in Canada if it is the first international launch. And this is often the case where you see launches available in the United States and maybe not in other Canadas or other countries, including Canada. So this really creates an odd incentive structure. And you know, ultimately, an automatic investigation could be conceivably avoided by delaying a launch. And I think, you know, we're starting to look at the analysis of how many products this might apply to, whether it's, you know, kind of the 15-20% range. But regardless, I think this is something that we need to be mindful of. What is the implication for delays and launches in Canada? You know, at the end of the day, the bottom line is IMC is really pushing for a suspension of this regime, and kind of a full rework of the guidelines, which, you know, in our view currently are not currently viable. And maybe I'll just leave it there and pass it over to Lorraine, who can maybe provide a bit more perspective on a kind of a company basis. Bill, you're on mute.
Am I on mute?
No, I was on mute. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and now we've got the full panel back out. But Lorraine, the first question would be to you: what happens at the global pricing tables at a major pharmaceutical company when they see something like this? Any insights given what Neil and Mike have gone through?
Well, you know, before I get there, I want to thank Cord and Durhan for inviting me to join this important conversation today. As background, I actually myself live in a family with a rare disease. And 11 years ago this month, I lost my sister to it. And my parents and brother both have active disease and related symptoms. Bill, you had said in the introduction that I work with a biopharmaceutical company known as BeiGene. It is a global oncology-focused biotech company founded in 2010, and in 12 short years, it's obtained regulatory approval, and I make that important distinction, in nearly 60 countries worldwide. So despite all the incredible progress, and I saw the note from one of the participants, in oncology treatment. 10 million people died last year from cancer. We need a solution which includes access to new medicines, advancement in health systems, and policy to support broader access to diagnosis and care. When I took on this role, so Bill, you had actually introduced me as, having come and worked in the Canadian marketplace. When I took on this global role, I could have never imagined how incredibly complex pricing at a global level can be. Each country has its own rules for referencing and pricing, as Neil and Michael have alluded to. The complexity comes when a country has both formal but also informal price referencing. And when it price reference, like Canada, it rebenches prices in a set period of time. Early on in my tenure, I tried naively to create an illustrative map for our senior management using just 5 countries. When it was completed, and I'm sure you can imagine this, it was reminiscent of a ball of wool that a kitten had played with for hours, or those flight maps that you see when you fly. It was a complex web of lines that was totally uninterpretable. As an example, in one country in which Beijing operates, this country has 35 reference countries. In 2 others, there's 28. Added to this is the ever-evolving political landscape where governments are trying to manage costs, and therefore the prices in those countries are changing. For example, there are changes announced or pending in Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, and others. The rules within the rules are also constantly evolving. This is further nuanced by the complexity of the global market itself. In many markets, in many companies, different from Beijing, there are numerous partners with more experience and expertise in each market with the rights for the product in that market. For a company such as that, their price is still a reference price for the patent holder. And all this to say, when you have a pricing framework such as this that provides a great deal of current and future uncertainty, it provides much consternation. Trying to move quickly and to get medicines to patients who need them when they need them is one of the biggest challenges we have in front of us all, regardless of which side of the table we're sitting on. No one entity can solve these complex problems. It requires collaboration between industry, government, and academia. And, you know, it's sad to say, as Durhan opened the conversation, we're revisiting conversations and discussions that happened decades ago. After all, we are all patients, and when we need a medicine, we want it. And as a Canadian, I want to be assured that I can get it. Without greater understanding, to answer your question, Bill, of the implications of pricing, a clear framework like every other country, it is obviously up to an individual company, but the uncertainty and complexity may lead companies with complex portfolios to wait or not enter Canada as a result, because of the alternatively cascade of implications is catastrophic.
Thanks, Lorraine. You know, Durhan, why don't you react to what we've heard? I remember a few years ago, you went as part of a Team Canada mission to Asia to try to drum up interest in investing and commercializing medicines here in Canada. I mean, what would happen if you had to go on that mission again and do that again? I'm just thinking, stay at the international level and then bring it back to Canada, where you're the leader for rare disorders in this country. What does this mean for patients with rare disorders here in Canada because of what you've heard?
Well, interesting. You went all the way back to that mission. You know, it was actually with Health Innovation. It was with Innovation Canada. It was not too much with health, and that was really, you know, as you say, to talk to companies in Korea and in Taiwan about bringing drugs for rare diseases or developing drugs for rare diseases. And I would say, at that point, this is 4 or 5 years ago, the first question that came out of their mouths was, and what about the PMPRB? And there was, in fact, a real concern that this was going to create chaos and they're trying to bring in therapies. And unfortunately, if we went back there today, I think they tar and feather us and saying like, are you kidding us? We've kind of gone around the bend with you on this before. And we did see, and we have seen therapies that are in development that end up in the US and do not come to Canada. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing for many of those therapies, which are the only in class for some of these, diseases. And that, of course, is quite scary. It also means that we didn't get clinical trials here when we could have, in order to provide not only advanced access to therapies, but create the learning environment in the, in our health systems and in our clinical teams. I mean, this is what really kind of almost puzzles me, quite frankly, for all of you. I mean, on the one hand, we have, Canada coming forth and saying, we're going to invest $1 billion in creating a rare disease drug strategy so that we can improve, we can have earlier access, we can have better access to drugs for rare diseases. And then the other hand, and we heard, I mean, I was so delighted, when Minister Duclos actually spoke at a very recent, gathering in Ottawa, with the Genome Canada and others, to really talk about how important it is for Canada to invest in research and development, invest in terms of the advancement. And I had a private side meeting with him, and he was very supportive of our need to actually be able to not only bring these therapies in, but also invest in the development of it in Canada. But, these same regulations would also be prohibitive in terms of any kind of research that would be done in Canada in order to make these drugs not only available here, but elsewhere. And I think, again, it goes back to the fundamental problem, right? PMPRB kind of thinks itself as trying to be able to have, sort of good management of drug budgets by squeezing down on the cost of drugs so tightly that, we'll get them as cheap as possible and have as few drugs that are high cost drugs or innovative drugs coming to therapy as possible. Well, yeah, that's one way of managing so-called drug budgets, but it's perverse. And the best way to do it is what we've been talking about. Let us invest, quite frankly, in terms of systems that would actually encourage drugs to come in, encourage manufacturers to come in, encourage, the earliest access possible. But I think, what, I look at all of us here, right? And, Neil and Michael as well. Perhaps we've not done a good enough job of being able to sell the message that investing in innovative therapies is the first step to investing in diagnosis, the first step to investing in clinics, the first step to investing in good research, and that all of that investment returns many-fold over, in terms of the benefits to patients and families, but also in terms of the economics of the system. So, maybe we've gotten too hung up on the fact that this is the right thing to do, as opposed to saying it is the economically sound thing to do, and it's the only way that we're going to be able to advance. So, I'm appealing to many of the economists that are sitting here. God only knows why I would want economists to step on my team, but we need to have the economists kind of stepping up with us and be able to say, yes, I just came back from Europe. I just came back to the World Orphan Drug Congress. I was actually at the World Health Summit where we talked about access to gene therapy. I was just at the World Cancer Congress, and every single one of those congresses, I'm sitting on panels looking globally where they say the investments in the innovative research, innovative therapies, innovative diagnosis are the only ways we're going to save. And that means not saving lives, but saving money. So, we know that, we don't have the same situation with COVID where everybody, is catching this horrible disease. We do have that situation, though, in rare diseases where people are being affected. And really sorry to hear, about your sister, Lorraine, but that's the case, right? People are going to die because we're not providing access. And I'm not saying something could have intervened in that case, but we also know other patients that are dying and do die because they don't get access. And I think that's kind of as big a crisis as COVID was, certainly for many of these patients. And so how do we get us turned around so the PMPRB doesn't become that caucus says, I want to squeeze down prices, where hopefully the rest of the environment seems to be opening up to say, yes, we need to do that investment.
So Durhan, this is a good segue back to the others on the panel. Next week, we're going to be talking about Canada's rare disease strategy and, where those investments can be made, tracked, analyzed, and shown to be valuable. Is some of what the PMPRB is trying to do in terms of lower drug prices and more value possible to happen in a different venue in the context of a rare disease drug strategy or a rare disease strategy writ large? And that's a question for anyone on the panel. Like, can they, Neil, you hinted at it, it can be happen at the payer level. What's the takeaway for next week's conference at CORD and what we're trying to do there?
So, Durhan's comments, sadly, the PMPRB does not care. They don't care about investment. They don't care about rare diseases. They just don't care. And, this is going to fall on deaf ears to the PMPRB. Unfortunately, it's going to have to be at government levels. The R&D, they repeatedly say that's not our job. The balance, that's somebody else's job. Their job is solely to lower drug prices. That's their perspective. They don't care. And so you really, the message has to be to government and senior bureaucrats within government that PMPRB is a significant impediment to the introduction of new innovative medicines in Canada. The second thing I'd add, we talked about the early days of the PMPRB. At the early days, PMPRB staff engaged with industry, not to, have industry write the pricing guidelines for them, but to understand what was practical, what was reasonable, what the impact might be. And there was a lot of informal back and forth. And then when the staff of the PMPRB finally started preparing guidelines, it proposed them in bulletins. And the industry wasn't happy, but at least, that initial process was the result of engagement with the industry to understand what could be done, what could not be done in terms of, and what the likely impact might be. And then subsequent to the consultations, even more changes were made to guidelines. But what is so shocking in this case, that this whole switch from price test to investigation criteria was a complete surprise to everybody. Nobody knew this was coming other than the PMPRB staff. And this is. I was just incredulous when I read those draft guidelines for the first time, that they could just bring this out of thin air and completely change their approach without any engagement with industry, without any discussion about what the impact might be. And quite clearly, now is the time to go to senior levels of government to say PMPRB is just completely out of touch with what needs to happen in this country with respect to pharmaceutical pricing and access to pharmaceuticals, particularly for drugs for rare diseases.
Bill, there's a question in the chat there on oncology medicines, and I maybe just add a comment that, the same type of uncertainty for rare disease medicines and, also applies for rare oncology medicines. And where that comes in is around subsequent indications. As we know, some of the products, and in particular the pipeline of products, you have a product or a molecule that has multiple therapeutic uses, and each one of those therapeutic uses requires different considerations and launch considerations. And the PMPRB guidelines have some very challenging discussions around the treatment of subsequent indications and therapeutic referencing in relation to subsequent indications. And we kind of think that this will have a ratcheting effect on products and prices downwards over time. And that's a large part of the concern on these guidelines. So great question from the chat on oncology.
Thanks, Mike. Lorene, an earlier slide I showed that the PCPA is driving what they claim to be $3.4 billion in savings to governments across the country. And the vast majority of that is on the brand side. In fact, we've got some data that shows that the actual value of those rebates are north of $4 billion a year. And Neil, you were saying that's where you can really drive some value. I'm just wondering if you've got some insights or thoughts for the CORD conference next week to talk about, innovative agreements or ways to get more value and have earlier access to some of these medicines that would achieve several objectives, as Durhan said, investment, but also the health objectives of improving the lives of Canadians. Any thoughts on that in terms of doing things a little bit differently at the payer level?
Are you asking me or Neil?
I'm asking you. What can
Yeah.
we do?
I mean, when we look at other markets, they are absolutely doing innovative price agreements that allow for early access. And if we want to look to other markets, which we should, this is providing early access to innovative medicines and providing the savings that health systems and payers are looking for. So it's a win-win.
Yeah. Neil, anything to add there, or is that what your experience is as well?
Well, absolutely. And the starting point in these other markets is they want these new technologies, right? They want them. PMPRB doesn't care if we have new innovative technologies or not. And that's, highlighted by the fact that they don't even have a level of therapeutic improvement criterion anymore in terms of assessing prices. So in all these other countries, they want them. They understand that, there may be challenges with respect to cost and affordability. And that's why they come up with these really innovative agreements. And the innovation in terms of the innovativeness of the agreements comes from both industry and the individual country that find clever ways to make sure these products and these technologies are available in those markets. And they vary from country to country. But what's really important, particularly for products that are innovative, and that's rare diseases and oncology and others, they really want them. So they try and they work hard to try and get those products into those countries and find innovative ways of addressing issues with respect to cost and affordability. Again, PMPRB doesn't care.
Yeah, it's interesting that the PMPRB provisions were actually exempted for COVID therapeutics and vaccines, at least certain elements of them. I know we're almost at time, and Durhan, I'm going to throw it back to you to sort of close it out and remind people about the consultation of the guidelines are due December 5th, and CORE will be developing a submission. And here's some key links for people to go to if they want to engage more.
I think Lorraine will agree with me. We sat on that committee and nobody listened to a word that we said, unless they were already voicing opinions that they wanted to hear. We sat there month after month, went through all these drafts. Nobody there is listening. It's exactly what, Neil and others have already said. So quite frankly, yeah, you got to write something into them, but you got to write to them very clearly with the idea that they will not pay a bit of attention to what you're saying. I don't know if they don't care or whether or not they are so focused on that one single mission of can we get the very lowest price, for any drug, that we don't really care what the fallout is. What we do need to do, Bill, and you know that as well as I do, we need to elevate it back up to what everybody's saying. It's got to go to the policy level. It's got to go to the health minister. I cannot believe that this is the health minister says we want to invest, we want to do partnerships, we want to promote a rare disease drug strategy. Oh, but by the way, we're going to squeeze out, these drugs so draconianly that nobody's going to come in. I do not believe that's going to be the case. So I think we need to write that strongly, but I am really saying very strongly as well, I need some health economists to step on board with me and basically show that return on investment. It's there. We haven't pushed it out hard enough. It is the right thing to do. It saves lives, but guess what? It will save monies, and I cannot overemphasize that. So let us get us in line. So yeah, you got to write something. But, quite frankly, I could write it on the back of a napkin quite as much as they're going to pay attention to it. We got to write to the higher powers.
Yeah, well, and I think that on Monday and Tuesday, a lot of people are going to be on the line for that. It'll be a hybrid event, right? So people can Zoom in as well as attend in person. But that's a different way to get to better access to medicines and better care for rare than the regulations. Is that something up? Did we just lose Durhan? Well, let's leave it at that because you're going to see a lot of Durhan and me on Monday. Any final words or thoughts, Neil, Lorraine, or Mike, to close this out? Are we good?
The last thing I would is to really try and step up the advocacy. It's difficult to get people's attention these days with COVID and RSV and the provinces fighting over funding and in the healthcare area. and everything else that's going on. So PMPRB has sort of slipped off the radar a bit. I think it's really important to try and get PMPRB back on the radar of policymakers and the political folks that have some influence in this area.
Well, with that, thank you, Lorene. Thank you for sharing your personal impact and stories. It really brings things home when you do that, and takes a lot of courage to be at the center of so many of these big discussions that seem to be numbers, but saying no, there are people behind those. So I have to really thank you for doing that, to remind us that these are not statistics; these are people that we're talking about. And Mike, thanks for bringing forward some of the specific examples of the why and how this could be so problematic, and everyone on the line, and we had 150 people join. A lot of them are dropping off now. This is recorded. It'll be up again on Chord's YouTube channel and SlideShare. With any luck, we won't have to do this again in the new year. So we'll see many of you on Monday and Tuesday, virtually or in person. And if we don't, all the best in the run up to the holidays, and thank you again for joining us. We'll see you soon.